Hello and welcome to the Money Magpie Invest podcast. I'm Jasmine Birtles, and today I'm joined by the former MP, former Minister of State for the Northern Ireland Office and for the Cabinet Office, Steve Baker. Hello, Steve.
Hello, Jasmine. Thanks very much indeed for having me on.
Oh, well, great to see you, and thank you for taking the time because you're on the road right now, aren't you? You're talking to me
Yeah,
from a rather nice looking pub.
yeah, I've just had an excellent curry. But yeah, I've been out doing some business today. Obviously, I've got to make a living, and I've been having some business meetings this morning on my motorcycle. And yeah, I've just pulled in. So hence, please forgive the quite scruffy motorcycle hair.
You look excellent. Well done. And the reason I asked you to come on this podcast, Steve, is because I heard a really interesting talk that you gave recently, where you gave in quite stark figures the state of the state, if you like. You know, the fact that the way we're living in the West, the way most democracies in the West are living, with the state paying for this, that, and the other, including pensions, including benefits, including all sorts, health, a whole lot, is simply not sustainable. What would you say are the top line facts and figures about this?
I try always to stay on the mainstream information. So the government's own Office for Budget Responsibility scrutinises public spending. They produce every 2 years what they call the Fiscal Sustainability Report. And the latest report shows spending soaring away in the years ahead, with taxes even at the present really excruciating levels, reducing revenues which stagnate. So there's an enormous gap opens up between what the government is spending and what the government can bring in. And of course, we need growth. You don't get growth with these levels of taxation. So, really, the headline is that we've got about 20 years until the state is hard into default. The government actuaries audit something called the National Insurance Fund. That isn't the sovereign wealth fund. That is like a current account through which a lot of tax washes and then out into pensions and so on. And the National Insurance Fund still needs to stay above zero. It's due to hit zero in 2043 to 4, according to, again, the government's actuaries. So they're really the key points I'd land with people. There's a big problem. And I'm afraid that big problem arises because over decades, promises have been made for age-related spending and they haven't been funded over the years. And the idea of paying for them pay as you go is now running onto the rocks, and that can be seen in other places in the world.
So let's unpick a few of those, or let's just talk about the state pension for a start. I mean, you're mentioning that, you know, pay as you go, the money washing in and washing out, because I think a lot of people don't realise that the state pension is, let's be honest, you know, a Ponzi scheme. We think that we pay into the national insurance and that there's this nice little pot of money that's sitting there for when we retire, but it doesn't work like that, does it? How does it exactly work?
Well, no, well, government doesn't like to what they call hypothecate tax, that is ring fence it for a purpose. They just take the tax into the government's coffers and then spend it as it needs to be spent. So, I mean, I've lost track of the number of times decent people of good faith have said to me, but I've paid into my taxes all my life. I've paid my national insurance stamp, but to say people often say it all my life, and I expect the pension to be there for me. And they're right to say that in the sense of the expectation that's been created. They're right that they've paid their taxes and done the right thing. But unfortunately, what's missing there is that over the years, politicians didn't save that money to be spent later to pay for their own pensions. They spent that money on other people's pensions. And really, the mind can recoil in horror. And it's not much in people's interests to accept it as true, but it is true. And we're going to have a really big problem as a result. I'm quite grateful I'm no longer standing for election. I mean, I've always been honest about this, but I can be really firm without worrying about the electoral consequences for me. Folks, the welfare state's going to default in our lifetimes because these promises were made and the provision to keep those promises wasn't honestly made. And it's going to bite us all. And it can be seen to be biting us, particularly in France at the moment.
Well, absolutely. I mean, there's the French government that has actually collapsed, basically because they're trying to bring some reality to their budget. Say, look, we've got to cut this, we've got to cut that. You can't have that. And the government representing the people, I'm assuming, said no. So gone. I mean, what do you think is going to happen next? Are they going to see sense at some point? That what I consider to be seeing sense.
Well, yeah, this is a really good question. And the politics of France and the politics of the European Union could easily come into conflict because as an EU member state, the government of France is required to pass a budget within certain parameters. and they may not be able to, and that will raise really severe tensions if they can't. But this is one, I'm afraid, of the fundamental problems of democracy. If the public are firmly resolved to live beyond their means, indeed to live beyond everyone's means, and they say that to their politicians and insist upon it, even perhaps not really thinking through the implications, I'm afraid politicians will vote that way. And that's why the French government's fallen. And I'm afraid in the UK, we're not much better. The Labour government chose to take away winter fuel payments from better off pensioners. Now, I know that's painful for people, but I would say that when it was introduced, it was a byword for waste. I remember better off pensioners telling me they'd spend it on a good bottle of whiskey or they'd give it to charity. They were asking why they were being given that money. But now it's being taken away. People are behaving as if it's an outrage. Now, the Conservative Party ought to have just backed the Labour government in taking away that money, because MPs should all understand the fiscal position of the UK, and they should know that we're going to have to make age-related spending cuts, and we're just going to have to. We can't go on like this in the medium to long term. So really, I'm afraid France becomes therefore a harbinger of what lies ahead. If the Conservative Party, the party of fiscal responsibility, isn't willing to do something as straightforward as back Labour in taking away an unnecessary benefit from better off pensioners, we are going to have a disaster.
So you're talking about age-related benefits, particularly. So I mean, as you know, we are an aging population. Europe is, the West is generally. Is this why you're particularly targeting age-related benefits? Are you saying that there won't be enough people earning, young people earning, to pay for the older people who will be taking?
Well, of course, I'm not saying this in terms of targeting anyone. As I say, I'm no longer standing for election. I won't run for election except in the most extraordinary circumstances. I'm trying to just contribute to a public conversation that we desperately need to have. There's no question of me targeting anyone, and I don't mind you putting it that way, but it's just a fact that we are getting older. We don't have the young people. It's called the dependency ratio. We don't have the young people to pay the benefits to keep the old people who we have. And it's not just about pensions, of course. It's we are living longer with more chronic conditions that interrelate to one another. We need social care. And all of these things add up to an immensely expensive bill for healthcare, for pensions, and for social care. And that's swamping budgets. It's swamping budgets at council level, and it's swamping budgets nationally. You know, we're becoming a country with or rather, we're becoming a health service with a country attached. And that we can't do that. We're going to have to somehow keep the basic functions of the state going, and that is going to mean making cuts where we don't want to make cuts, and that's on healthcare and on pensions and on education if we're not careful.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking of some of the figures. I mean, you've mentioned the health service pensions. I mean, my understanding, I think, is that the National Health Service costs us about 250 billion pounds a year, and I think the pensions, you'd know better, the state pension is about what, 120 billion a year, something like that. Education's just, it's pennies next to that. I can't remember, but it's a remarkably small amount.
I haven't got the budget in front of me, and I'm afraid I am travelling back from business meetings. But education is one of the larger areas of spending.
Okay.
Defence ends up looking quite small, but of course, debt interest is starting to overwhelm other budgets like defence. And it's a really serious problem, and it deserves close attention. I mean, politicians ought to be being honest with the public and say, unless we get growth, unless we get productivity gains, we're not going to be able to keep the spending promises that we've made, and it's going to really matter. But the quality of the conversation which we've been having as a nation has been poor for far too long.
Yes. So, I mean, part of the problem, I assume, is because, as you say, MPs will do what their voters are asking them to do, understandably, but also they're sort of thinking in 5-year chunks. I mean, you're talking about things falling apart in 20 years' time. Well, today's politicians will probably know about that, but they're not going to want to do what they have to do. I mean, as you say, when you see what was the reaction to taking the winter fuel payments away from pensioners. Do you see any way in which we can have this conversation? Because 20 years is not a long time in the grand
No,
scheme of things.
it's absolutely not a long time. It's only 4 election cycles. I mean, this is what people forget. It's only 4 election cycles until the Government Actuaries Department forecasts the National Insurance Fund is down to zero, and we've got a really serious problem. And it can't just be topped up. I managed to get this into the press a few months ago, and Number 10's reactions was, well, we'll just top it up from tax. But it's not that simple. The money won't be there.
No.
So my goal here really is to get your viewers, your listeners, writing to their MP and asking them the hard questions. I'm afraid in a democracy, and this is something I wouldn't like to say if I was standing for election again, in a democracy, electors get the government they deserve. Now, I can understand why people don't pay attention to all these facts and details. Of course I can. When you're one of 75,000 people in a constituency voting once every 5 years, there's strong incentives to just leave it and get on with one's life. But the problem with that approach over our lifetimes and longer is that it's led to this unsustainable fiscal position, because what we do, unfortunately, as a public, we demand low taxes and high spending. And you just can't have low taxes and high spending. You've got to pick one and have a balanced budget, because the alternative is debt and then currency debasement, that is inflation. And you look at COVID, for example, we didn't get through COVID by spending our savings. We got through COVID from borrowing from markets. But in those markets, the Bank of England was buying the government's debt instruments with something called quantitative easing. And I'm sorry it's a bit complicated. This is why people talk about money printing, because I'm afraid ultimately that's what it amounts to. All of the money, more or less, you can find the charts again from the OBR, just about all the money we needed to get through COVID and build that bridge ultimately came from the Bank of England creating it. And that's a really poisonous thing to do to a society, to pour all that new money in.
We are an investment site. So what does this mean for investors? Because it looks like economic collapse in 20 years' time, potentially. Does that mean that it's pointless to invest, or should we invest more?
Well, it can never be allowed to be pointless to invest. I mean, our civilization rests on the division of labor, and that requires proper investment in capital projects to produce. So we can never allow it to be pointless to invest. But, I don't mind saying I recognize that it's a very difficult environment in which to invest once you adopt the position that I have. I happen to have found a financial advisor who recognizes the same economic problems that I recognize, and he's putting together a portfolio which should be defensive and wealth preserving. Not that I'm a very wealthy man, but there we are. But, it's not for nothing that I'm a seed investor in something called GlimpPay, which has put gold back into the monetary system. Anyone can have a GlimpPay account. There are competitors like Gold Money, but you can have a card, you can have an account, and you can put physical gold behind that card and spend it if you wish, and hold it if you wish, and send it indeed. There's also, of course, Bitcoin. I've always been very skeptical about Bitcoin, recognize that Bitcoin is happening. And that's why I've become an advisor to Axiom, a venture capital fund in Bitcoin. So I think we do need to look at these alternative monies like Bitcoin and gold. We need to continue investing in the stock market. And we need to look extremely carefully at what is defensive. But I would be really straying beyond my competence if I made any specific investment recommendations, that's for sure.
Fair enough. But yes, I think those are good ideas there. So finally, Steve, as a viewer, as a voter, your main advice is for us to contact our MPs and say, have you looked at this very difficult question? Because you need to, and we as a nation need to get together and discuss this.
I would absolutely love it if people wrote to their MP and said, have you looked at the fiscal sustainability projections from the Office for Budget Responsibility, and what are you going to do about it? And send them a personal email, send them a short email, and ask very specific questions, because they'll end up with a template response to send you. But if you send a short, polite, personal email asking what they are going to do about sustaining the long-term public finances of the UK, your MP will actually have to do the work and look into it. So please, they won't thank me, that's why I smile, but your MP will be forced by your polite and short letter that's personal to go and actually look at the numbers, and I recommend that to you. We've got to get MPs into shape that they're taking seriously in this Parliament the problem that we're going to default on the welfare state within about the next 15 to 20 years. And as I say, we can see it already in France. We can see that Labour's trying to sort it out with the winter fuel payment. In the UK, the Conservatives are incapable of supporting it, it seems, politically. The only way through this, I'm afraid, is voters telling politicians what they require, which is a balanced budget. And that's going to be tough. But the alternative, I'm afraid, inevitably is the destruction of currencies. And I know that's a very serious thing to say, but I base it in a lot of scholarship. And the Bank for International Settlements, which is in a sense the central banker's central bank, they wrote in a paper back in about 2010 that they didn't use the word collapse, but monetary instability was a very bad risk. Because in the end, governments that are desperate for money and can't raise it from tax or from borrowing, they always resort to the printing press, as we did during COVID. So, Bank for International Settlements, the Office for Budget Responsibility, the government actuaries, you take all of those sources together and weave yourself your own picture. It doesn't require anyone to go off and look at kind of arcane stuff. It's all really serious, credible material, and it points in a direction that's very worrying. We're living beyond our means. It's not possible to keep doing that, and it leads to disaster. And the only way through is MPs gripping the data, gripping the facts, and getting behind balancing the budget.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Steve. This is Steve Baker, former MP and very knowledgeable person when it comes to the state of the nation and the state of our state. Thank you so much, Steve, for coming along. And thank you. Great to have you. And if you this is the first time you've seen the podcast, do like and share it. Sign up to MoneyMagpie, sign up to the MoneyMagpie Invest newsletter, which comes out every other Saturday. And tell all your friends. I'm Jasmine Birtles, CEO and founder of MoneyMagpie.com.